Hello, America. Welcome back. This is the Right Guys podcast. This is Josh.
This is Eric.
It is so good to be back. We have a real kick butt episode for you today. We're really looking forward to it. We're excited. Thanks so much for following us on Facebook, for checking out our website, the Right Guys Podcast .weebly.com, following us on Twitter at Right Guys USA. Our YouTube channel is up, alive, and kicking. The Right Guys Media on YouTube, so please follow us there. We'll be posting clips from these episodes as well as episodes to come up there, as well as expanding into new, exciting content that we're really looking forward to. So we'll keep you posted on that. It's all planned out and ready to go. Eric, how you doing, brother?
Doing great. Excited for the podcast.
It's going to be a good one. We've been thinking a lot. You know, this election has come upon us whether we wanted it to or not, perhaps. But we hear a lot of people say there seems to be some confusion about what we're voting for, and it's not the people's fault. I think the subconscious understanding of the government, of the American government, has changed.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Where we hear people say, "Who do we want to run the country? If Donald Trump runs the country, it will be catastrophic because he will run the country. And if Hillary Clinton runs the country, it will be catastrophic because she'll be in power and she can run the country." When unfortunately that's not how the American government was ever supposed to work.
Yeah, as I understand it was supposed to be a lot more like quite a few hundred people running the country, right?
So, right, there's 535 congressmen. That's 100 senators, 435 congressmen against one president. Now, there's a vice president.
And mind you, that's just the federal government. Then you have the state level of all the other governments as well.
Right, so, plus the judicial branch.
And that.
So there's any amount of hundreds or thousands of people, so-called, running the government. And I know the president is the president of the United States. But I made this list as I was thinking about this before the show. Powers that Congress has. We'll start with the president. How about that? The president can veto legislation. The president is the executive. He's in charge of enforcing the laws that Congress passes. And he's the commander-in-chief of the military. So the military really kind of answers to him. He's kind of in charge of national security aside from legislating.
He can't even go to war without approval of Congress either, though. So.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
So those are the president's powers, summed up. The Congress, however, has the following powers. The Congress can override a veto. In the Senate, they can filibuster. The Senate can also, actually, it's necessary for the Senate to also vote to approve judicial appointees, any bureaucratic appointee. The leader of the Library of Congress had to go through hearings to the Senate. So really, any political appointee has to go through the Senate. Congress has the power of the purse, which includes sequestration powers and the budgetary reconciliation powers, which are very powerful. You can use those to basically starve any legislation that you disagree with. Let's see, there's the treaty power in the Senate, where the Senate has ultimately powerful say over foreign international relations. That's one of the reasons why the senators have 6-year terms. Is because the Founding Fathers wanted to give senators a good amount of time to become acquainted with international affairs and to provide some consistency with international affairs. Any others come to mind?
Not particularly, but I think the point of everything that we're saying here is that we've seen a great shift in American politics in general, where the power is kind of shifting from that, what we just said, to more like individual parties or actual individuals, people. Yeah. And you see something that's a really dangerous thing, particularly historically. There's a lot of examples where that just doesn't work.
Right. I feel like we've moved away from separation of powers, really, to kind of an unconscious dictator mentality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Honestly, where we've talked about one party rule in the past. And we definitely have one-party rule, I think, and we've made the case for that I don't know how many times. That the Democrat Party gets everything they ever want in government. But it's much more than that. And that's what we're getting here. It's getting at here. It's much more than just one party being in control. It's one branch of government that's in control of America.
Yeah.
And it's been like that for so long that we're just used to it. It's the president and the bureaucracies that directly report to him, that he is directly responsible over, that really have the real power in the American government. You know, does that make sense, Eric?
No, absolutely, yeah, and that's exactly what I'm alluding to. That's the scary trend that we're seeing here in the United States government. And really, as we've thought about this podcast, Josh and I noticed that you can really equate that to what happened to the Romans, actually, and several other people in history. But probably, we're probably mostly based off of the Roman Republic. That's probably in ancient governments, that's probably the one you can compare easiest to the American government. And it's actually it goes beyond that. It's really interesting because Rome originally, a little history lesson, actually started out as a kingdom, the Roman kingdom, under rule by the Etruscans. And they actually had a senate back in those days, but that was pretty much ornamental. They didn't do anything, had no power.
Right, a completely honorific group of people.
Exactly. And at some point they decided that they wanted to represent the people better, and they threw off the Etruscan rule, and then the Senate represented the people. Right?
Yeah, that's correct.
And so it's actually really fascinating because in ancient times they developed a system of government that actually represented the people reasonably well. I don't think it's nearly as efficient as the American government originally was.
Yeah.
But they had a system. They had no dictator, no permanent dictator anyway. They had two consuls elected by the Senate, who was elected by the people. And so, thus, the people were represented. There was, different like classes of people, the plebeians, the patricians, but everyone was represented to some degree or another.
Right.
But you can see a similar trend there. So they devised a system of government that worked for the people, that represented the people at least better than what they originally had. But what did they do in emergency times?
Yeah. So what we've learned just off our research is in times of
war,
extreme circumstance. Theoretically, the Senate would appoint a dictator that would have pretty much unlimited powers to deal with whatever the problem was at the time.
It's incredibly irresponsible.
If Rome was being invaded, they would appoint a single ruler that would have all power, not just over the military, but all power to do whatever he thought was necessary to save the Roman Republic. And he was supposed to either to surrender his powers back to the Roman Senate.
Within 6 months.
Yeah, when the problem was resolved, or if 6 months passed by and the problem's not dealt with or whatever, he was supposed to give his powers back.
So there's never supposed to be a permanent dictator ever in the Roman government system. The problem with that, though, is that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. I don't remember how that quote goes. As a matter of fact, there was only one notable dictator to be spoken of, whose name was Cincinnatus, I think was his name. A simple farmer, I believe, from Spain, kind of like in that movie Gladiator, who he was actually the only one of note that ever gave the power back when he was supposed to, within 15 days of resolving the conflict.
Right.
That's not a very good track record, because the last temporary dictator that they ever had was Julius Caesar.
Emphasis on temporary.
Right.
Use of extensive air quotation marks.
Absolutely.
Here in the studio.
Absolutely. He was the last I dictator who never gave his power back.
And I think it's interesting too how much we really are based on the Roman government, not just the American government, but our civilization in general. I think the Romans called the Senate the Senate. Mm-hmm. They come up with the word dictator. Dictator didn't have the negative connotation that it has today. It signified this person that had powers for a time to deal with whatever problem came up, right, in Roman civilization. Yeah. So I just bring that up just to point out we didn't invent these words, dictator and Senate. These are words that
Republic.
These are the words that the Romans themselves used. So, just to be clear. Anyway, Eric, you were saying.
Yeah, Julius Caesar was the last temporary dictator, and it's really interesting how he shifted the power to himself. Julius Caesar was a very charismatic, easy to win you over kind of individual, and at some point the Senate gave a lot of power to the generals to incentivize their soldiers by giving them gold, land, and offering them all sorts of things, direct payment rather than just fighting for the glory of Rome, which really gave a lot of credibility and I guess, loyalty between the soldiers and the generals. So the generals really commanded a lot of power in Rome. And so when Julius, were you going to say something?
I was just going to point. So it really it changed the Roman culture among the Roman military to the point where Roman soldiers weren't loyal to the empire,
Or the Republic.
to the Republic, to Rome, so much as they were loyal to their general, the general that was over them directly.
Yeah.
And these generals are always competing, right, for power.
Oh, absolutely, 100%. Yeah, there's a lot of politics involved between the generals as well, and that's exact. Julius Caesar was a brilliant military commander, an absolute genius of a tactician, a very charismatic individual. They even say he had a great sense of humor. He just won his soldiers over, and they were incredibly loyal to him. And at some point, he established himself in the triumvirate with Crassus and Pompey. All three were generals. All three fighting wars, and he established himself as one of the consuls. Julius Caesar did.
So what happened to the Senate at this time? So
well, they were handing a lot of power over to not just the generals, but Julius Caesar himself as a dictator.
Okay.
Right.
So Julius Caesar is acting as a dictator at this time.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
And then the triumvirate was established, and so you have these guys basically. The three of them almost made the Senate kind of obsolete, where they weren't really doing what the Senate wanted, but they were kind of doing what they wanted to. Crassus was killed in battle at some point. Pompey was back in Rome, and Julius Caesar was off in Gaul, which is now modern-day France, fighting wars. And he was commanded by Pompey to come back to Rome without his army. At that point, he came and crossed the Rhine River. What's it? It's like this epic moment where Julius Caesar was supposed to come over this river without his army, and he came with all of his soldiers.
Probably.
Anyway, he came over and basically created a civil war, killed Pompey, and established himself as dictator for life, because at that point there was no one left to balance out the power.
Right.
It was just him.
I just think it's interesting how that didn't happen. They didn't transition directly from a functioning representative republic to a dictatorship.
Yeah.
It was just in my research I did. Before Julius Caesar, there's this other guy named Sulla, who was the first dictator the Senate had appointed in 100 years. He marches into Rome, breaks the rules of Rome, actually breaks the laws. You're not supposed to enter Rome with your army. He does. He kills his rival in Rome, establishes himself, basically intimidates the Senate into making him dictator for a time. He uses his dictatorial powers to change the Roman constitution, change the Roman laws, making the dictatorship stronger. He dies shortly thereafter, but it was Julius Caesar, as Eric was explaining, that really actually built on the expanded dictatorial powers that Sulla created. So this was a gradual process of gradually giving more and more power away from the Senate, away from this elected representative body, to someone because they wanted that someone, that individual, to have more power to solve their problems.
Yeah, and you can see a trend with the particularly the Roman Senate at this time where they were afraid of just that. They were afraid of the dictators and more particularly the generals who had control over the armies.
Right.
They weren't allowed to enter Rome with their armies, right? As this guy clearly
for good reason, as we've seen.
Absolutely. And then, by the way, minor correction: Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon River.
Oh,
that was the one.
Excuses.
Yes. Anyway, so you can kind of see that. It's not that exact trend in America, but you can see some similarities that you can definitely draw between the two.
I think that's absolutely correct. There's this, I think we're doing exactly the same thing, and I think it's just human nature where people don't want to always be involved. They don't want to always be exerting effort, basically, in the government. People want a benevolent king to manage problems. They don't want to actually have to put in the effort to manage their problems themselves.
Absolutely, yeah. It's turning over, I guess, basically your agency to the government so they can make the decision for you, which was what the Romans did. During a time of war, hey, these people are attacking us. Whoever this is, take care of the armies and go solve the problem. Right.
I think it's worth pointing out too. One thing that Julius Caesar did to increase his appeal and his basically political power. He granted the slaves freedom, which is a good thing, but he also handed out freebies to everyone.
That's true.
The term bread and circus really comes from this period, where if you have, kind of like what we've talked about in previous episodes, if the government is giving you everything you want to survive, if you have your bread and you have the Colosseum, what more do you want, right? And giving citizenship to people who are not Romans, who are not Roman citizens, to allowing them to vote, which in turn caused them to vote for, the senators that support him.
Yeah, and there's two classes of people in the Roman Republic: the patricians and the plebeians. And he also appealed a lot to the plebeians, which was the vast majority of Roman citizens were the plebeians, and that's exactly who he was appealing to.
And going back to what you were saying before, too, I feel like this is what we're seeing in America. The government has usurped, like we talked about at the beginning of the podcast. The president does things that the president was never supposed to do. The federal government, does things that the federal government was never supposed to do. I think Barry Goldwater had summed this up quite succinctly in the same book that we read from last time, Conscience of a Conservative, where, do we have that quote? Let's read that quote.
Yeah.
Go for it, Eric.
Yeah, Conscience of a Conservative, this is Barry Goldwater. So he's talking about a few different examples how to measure when the government is overreaching what they're supposed to be doing. I'm just going to go ahead and read this. He says, there are a number of ways in which the power of government can be measured. First, one is the size of its financial operations. This one's really interesting. Federal spending is now approaching $100 billion a year, compared with $3.5 billion less than 3 decades ago. Let me point out really quickly, this book by Barry Goldwater was written in 1960.
1960.
And he's talking about how outrageous it is that the government is now spending $100 billion compared to 3 decades earlier when they were spending $1.5 billion. What is it now? What's the federal budget right now?
It's over $3.5 trillion.
I think it's in the neighborhood of almost 3.9.
I do know Barack Obama's requested budget for 2017 was about $4.5 trillion. That was his official budget request to the Senate.
That's outrageous. Even if you include inflation in those figures, it's still a crazy amount of increase between just 1960 and now, less than 60 years.
Right. I mean, so you can see, right? Yeah. I'll let Barry Goldwater sum it up. He does it beautifully.
Yeah, absolutely. So shall we just continue with the
go for it.
Cool. Another is the scope of its activities. A study recently conducted by the Chicago Tribune showed that the federal government is now the biggest landowner, property manager, renter, mover and hauler, medical clinician, lender, insurer, especially now, mortgage broker, employer, debtor, taxer, and spender in all history. Why is that?
That was in 1960. And I think if you take that into account, people say, do we really think, this was in 1960, do we really think that the federal government is smaller today than it was in 1960? We know it's not, just going off the spending numbers that Eric read. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Just, and how many problems do we want the federal government solving? Right?
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like we're doing exactly the same thing where we're gradually surrendering more and more power to an all-powerful, all-centralized leviathan, this mammoth government that has power to solve our problems because we wanted it to.
Yeah,
it's interesting, food for thought.
Yeah, definitely. Still another is the portion of the people's earnings government appropriates for its own use.
This is Barry Goldwater again.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Nearly a third of earnings are taken every year in the form of taxes.
And I do remember the amount of taxes that the government has collected has broken all records under the Obama administration. So that's definitely not gotten any smaller either.
Absolutely not. Yeah. Fourth and finally, this is again Barry Goldwater. A fourth is the extent of government interference in the daily lives of individuals. The farmer is told how much wheat he can grow. The wage earner is at the mercy of national union leaders, whose great power is a direct consequence of federal labor legislation. The businessman is hampered by a maze of government regulations and often by direct government competition. The government takes 6% of most payrolls and Social Security taxes and thus compels millions of individuals to postpone until later years the enjoyment of wealth they might otherwise enjoy today.
So that's so interesting because we've talked about Social Security a little bit before on the cast, but we want to make sure that we have money left when we retire. And so we make sure that the government has an agency called Social Security, a government bureau or something in the government, a program, government-owned program to make sure that our money will be taken care of so that we can have money when we're old. But what that results in is that government takes money from our paycheck and says that you can't spend this right now, you have to spend it later. If there's anything left of it by the time you're 65.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah, I think it's interesting that they point out too that particularly, the businessman is. How does he say? The businessman is hampered by a maze of government regulations. I mean, so many examples of that.
Right.
EPA.
I mean, how was it starting this podcast, for example? Eric, you're a small businessman. You've started business. What's it like getting a business started?
It's actually pretty tricky. I mean, you have to go through
Go through the process with us quickly.
Well, I guess really quick, it involves like registering your business online. There's all kinds of different tax things you have to do. And the point is, again, there's no level of starting a business that's not, I guess, monitored or influenced by the government in some way, right? And bigger businesses are even more greatly affected. Earlier we were talking about the EPA and what they do.
Federal regulation. As I was going through, I was doing the prep for this show, I found some interesting statistics with regards to regulation. So I'm gonna run through some regulations for you really quick, followed by some really interesting court cases that I think will shed light on the extent to which the federal government has power over people's lives. Now, keep in mind that the regulatory branch of government is the executive branch, right? The regulatory committees and agencies and bureaus are responsible to the President of the United States. These are laws. Regulations have the force of law. If you don't comply with the regulations, you are penalized in one way or another. And no one votes on these regulations. No one. There's no way to have any redress for these regulations. You can't repeal a regulation. So check this out. This is very interesting. This is from the Competitive Enterprise Institute, which every year conducts a study on the extent of regulations in the American economy. And they found that for the most recent year for which we have data, 2014, federal regulation and intervention cost American consumers and businesses an estimated $1.88 trillion in 2014 in lost economic productivity and higher prices. Put another way, that's $1.88 trillion that would otherwise be in the American economy in the form of higher wages, more businesses, lower prices. And moving on. Economy-wide regulatory costs amount to an average of $14,976 per household, which is around 29% of an average family budget of $51,100. That means if the total cost, if all these regulations that are costing you money did not exist, then the average family would have $14,976 more than they have currently. There are 60 new regulations for every law, on average, issued, which means that in 2014 there were 3,554 major new regulations compared to 224 new laws. Some of these regulations include, Eric was talking about the EPA. For example, just recently the EPA passed a series of new regulations designed to severely restrict energy production in America. These include the New Source Performance Rule, that's the name of the regulation, which mandates the use of extremely expensive and frankly undependable, undeveloped technology to reduce emissions. The existing Source Performance Rule, which requires extremely high emission standards. These things cost incredible amounts of money, and no one has had any say in making them. Right? No elected congressman ever proposed this rule. This did not come from the voice of the people. Essentially, what you're getting at, right? I mean, I'm curious. So, what's the difference between a regulation and like something like an executive order? What would be the difference in definition there? Well, I think an executive order, really, what an executive order was supposed to do, was allow the president to accomplish his goals as outlined in the Constitution, right? To run the military and to run the bureaucracies. We actually have an interesting list here that we've come across. George Washington, the first president of the United States, issued a grand total of 8 executive orders. In his first executive order was to the heads of government departments, quote, to impress me with a full, precise, and distinct general idea of the affairs of the United States, unquote. In other words, George Washington's executive order asked the other leaders of government bureaucracies and agencies to tell him what was going on and what their intentions were for the future. His most controversial executive order was when Congress was out of session. The president warned citizens not to interfere in the war between Britain and France.
Wow.
That is a far cry from the number of executive orders that we're seeing nowadays. FDR, Franklin D. Roosevelt, issued 3,522 executive orders.
Say that one more time.
3,522 versus 8 for George Washington. Barack Obama, while he's issued considerably less than 3,522, has still issued 235, and the executive orders that he has issued go widely beyond his role, his priorities.
Yeah, there's a big difference between the two examples of executive orders from President Washington that Josh just read and what not just President Obama but numerous other presidents have done. There's a lot of examples you can think of. Look at 1989 import ban on certain weapons by George H.W. Bush. That was an executive order.
Right.
Yeah, and then President Obama has done 200 and what is it?
235. Yeah.
235.
I mean, we could go on the executive amnesty mandate, executive order, the bathroom mandate, requiring that states not just have a separate bathroom for people who are having a little bit of an identity crisis, but mandating that boys can use girls' restrooms, which we may or may not get into later, depending on the time. We'll see. So I want to know, what has our government become? And on these there's these court cases too. Barry Goldwater mentioned in there that the government can now decide how much farmer a wheat can grow. He's being very literal.
How much wheat a farmer can grow.
Yeah.
Yeah. You said how much farmer can
how much farmer a wheat can grow. How much wheat a farmer can grow. That's specifically referring to a court case called Wickard v. Fulburn in 1941, where the Supreme Court ruled that the government had the power to regulate this farmer's production under the Commerce Clause. Now, the Commerce Clause says that the federal government can regulate interstate commerce. It means they can regulate things that pass in between states. The founders of the American Republic made this law, made this provision, this clause in the Constitution, to prohibit states from raising tariffs against each other. Basically, they made this law to encourage a free market economy. What the court ruled in Wickard v. Fulburn in 1941 was that by growing wheat, even though this farmer was not selling wheat, he was impacting interstate commerce, and therefore the federal government could tell him how much wheat he was legally allowed to grow. Even though he didn't sell, he was growing it for his own private use. So that now the government can decide how much of something you can grow. The government can regulate you when you don't sell something. In a different court case, Sebelius, named after the great Catherine Sebelius of Health and Human Services, I believe, of one of the architects of Obamacare. This case concerned the constitutionality of Obamacare. Chief Justice Roberts ruled that you can use the tax and spend clause to fine people who don't buy insurance. He said that even though the law stated that the fine was a fine, what they actually meant in the law was that the fine should be a tax, and so that we'll interpret it as a tax, and that it's legal, it's constitutional to force someone to buy something from someone else if you have a good reason for it. So now we have the government deciding how much you can, forcing you to buy something, forcing you to sell something, forcing you to not grow something,
forcing you to pay for Social Security.
Forcing you to pay for Social Security. We have the executive branch, which has incredibly just usurped its power, as we talked about in the executive order shenanigan that we're currently inflicted with.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to note that George Washington was our very first president, and during a very formative time of the United States, he only found the need to make 8 executive orders.
Yeah,
only 8, and then you have fast forward. A few hundred years, and all of a sudden we're making, for FDR, thousands of executive orders, which, I'd be interested to know more about each and every one of those, but there's just so many. The point I think we're trying to make, though, is that going back to what we were saying earlier, the power has really shifted, or maybe it's not completely shifted, but it is shifting from the people's representatives, much like the Roman Republic, to a certain few individuals.
Right, and the question that we're really asking here is when will this all-powerful government, when will the federal government decide that it is big enough and strong enough and regulates enough? We've seen we saw in Roman history and we've seen in our history this trend on the behalf of the American people, of the Senate. I have more stuff here that we could go into if we had more time about Paul Ryan and his budget giving Barack Obama more money than he ever even asked for, about the federal government bullying North Carolina, trying to make them let boys in the girls' bathrooms. We could go into all of that. We don't have time to. What I'm asking is, when will the government decide that it is in your life enough, that it has the power that it needs to accomplish its roles, the things that it's supposed to do? When will it decide that? When will it stop?
If I may.
You may.
I don't think it ever will. If I may just quickly read from Barry Goldwater's book one last time. He's quoting Lord Acton. Power corrupts men. Absolute power corrupts absolutely.
There you go.
So essentially what I'm getting at is it's a vicious cycle of power. As people in positions of power gain more power, they instinctively want more power and seek more power. Right. So you ask, when will the government say it's had enough? When will it be big enough?
Honestly, when will the government admit that it has enough power to accomplish the things that it's supposed to do?
Probably.
Or will
never.
it just continually keep telling us what we can sell and what we can buy and how much we can grow? Will it keep being the world's largest lender and regulator and borrower and spender and insurer and employer?
If you look historically, has any large government in the past ever been ever decided it's had enough?
No.
Right? Never. So they've either been stopped by the people, or they've become completely totalitarian.
Right. So something to think about as you go into this election, which is Tuesday. So do the best you can out there, folks. We support you. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for listening to our podcast. It's been a great time. I hope you enjoyed it. We enjoyed preparing for it. We enjoyed doing it. And we'll be back for more later. So be sure to tune in after the election has happened and you're hungover with fear, or just hungover, depending. I don't know. Thanks so much for listening. Follow us on Twitter at RightGuysUSA. Follow us on Facebook, our website, therightguyspodcast.weebly.com. Big shout out to our listeners. Thank you so much for tuning in. Eric, last words?
God bless America, and get out there and vote, folks.
Pass the liberty.
So what do you use of blind my mind? Some kind of game.